Hi, how's it going? This is Resident of Collingwood for YouTube, and I'm here to do my video about Paul Stoddard, Dark Shadows character, right? Carolyn's father, Elizabeth's husband. I keep thinking back to the time when you first really meet Paul Stoddard, because from a Dark Shadows standpoint, this character is more mentioned than he ever is showed. And even when Dennis Patrick plays him, Dennis Patrick isn't there that long before he gets killed off. Before his character gets killed off, I should say, of Paul Stoddard. Now, Dennis Patrick, we know, did play Jason McGuire as well, and I'm going to get into that here. The character differences between Paul Stoddard and Jason McGuire. Now, the first person to actually play Paul Stoddard is Paul Fabini, and if I mispronounce that, I apologize. But you see the back of his head, and then you hear his voice, and he's laughing. And again, up until this point, you've only heard about Paul Stoddard. You've heard about him, anytime he gets mentioned to Elizabeth, it's brush off. She doesn't really want to talk about Paul. And Carolyn herself, about where her dad is, everything's a brush off. And even when Roger brings him up, and Roger's like, I come home from school, I remember you not being the fairy tale couple you want to portray. Beautiful job by Lewis Edmonds, by the way. And Roger's right too. There's something to Elizabeth and Paul's relationship that doesn't quite sit right. Even before after Roger says it, it's like, well, wait a second. Because I did believe Roger, even though you might want to view Roger as somebody maybe you can't fully trust. But when he said that to Liz, you could tell by Lewis Edmonds' face, he's meaning what he's saying. Like, wait a second. No, I came home from school on breaks and vacations, and I heard you guys fighting. But doesn't. So, which is interesting. So, when you meet Paul Stoddard, actually meet him, you meet the back of his head and he's laughing. And this is in a flashback sequence. I found this amazing because this is the first time you're actually literally seeing the character of Paul Stoddard. And little about him, really. I mean, he knew Jason. And Jason is this con artist, so you're starting to sort of piece somewhat together maybe what type of person Paul was, not just by Jason's necessary actions, but more by his words. But he's sort of describing Paul Stoddard as, look, I know people think I'm greedy, but Paul was way more greedier than I was. And really, in Liz's flashback story, she sort of confirms this in many ways. When she's telling this story and you're seeing the back of his head and he's laughing, she's arguing with him about he can't take all this money. You can't take, that's Carolyn's life savings. That's for her. That's for our daughter. And he's just laughing about it like it's all one big joke. Like, I don't really care. He considers it severance pay for basically help bring, being Carolyn's father, and she's only like 5, I think, at the time when this is going down. So it's so weird. So it's this guy here, he's very cocky and he's very arrogant, and it's just as Jason has described him, that this guy is way more cocky and arrogant than Jason ever was. That Paul, from the brief time you meet him, actually literally meet him, I don't see Jason McGuire. I see somebody who's far more risk-taking and daring. I see somebody who's also twice as dangerous as Jason ever was. To me, if you ask me to pick between the lesser of two evils, between Paul Stoddard and Jason McGuire, I would probably pick Jason because at least you could negotiate with Jason. So I would more pick Jason to negotiate with than I would Paul, because once Paul has made up his mind on doing something, he's doing it. He's not going to negotiate some sort of other deal or way out of it for you. For Paul, it's his way or the highway. And I really never got that sense too much from Jason, or at least he was more tolerable of it than what Paul was. And, you have Elizabeth who takes a fire poker and hits him over the back of the head after she confesses she killed her husband. I love Dana Elker in this part here when he talks about when he's Sheriff George Patterson, and he's sort of listening to the story like, wait a second, you hit him over the back of the head with a fire poker, and you think you killed this guy? And he's not saying it with words, he's more saying it with his face, like, okay, I believe you hit him, but I don't necessarily believe you killed him. And I love that from Dana Elker. I think you get that right away when you see Dana Elker's face from Sheriff George Patterson, that he does not believe Elizabeth killed him, because it just doesn't feel right. Something's off here. And Jason has said, I'm telling you, there's nothing down there. There's nothing in that basement. And Patterson is sort of like listening to what Jason's saying, even though everybody's saying, yeah, right. There's nothing down there. That's what Jason says. And when they go down there to see if Paul Stoddard's body really is buried in the basement floor, it's not there. There's just empty chunks of, and it's amazing. It's like all this time it was one big lie to con Liz, because something Jason really tells you about Paul and his sort of story to Liz is that when she hits Paul, it only knocked him unconscious. He was only bleeding a little bit from the back of the head. But what Jason was most mad about wasn't necessarily Liz hitting him. It was about the fact that they only agreed on taking so much, that he wanted to take more than what they had agreed upon because Liz would notice. And Jason actually told Paul this, but Paul disagreed and wanted to take the full amount and was mad at him. So it's really interesting that, he's once you find out there's no body, and Jason does tell it, look, he was wanting to take more and more money than what they had agreed upon, which I believe Jason. Paul seems like the more greedy of the two. But I think a lot of the reason Jason's death happens at the hands of Barnabas is because Jason is tired of plans blowing up in his face. Think about it. Even though he got money for silence for Paul's alleged death, the plan that they had seemingly did blow up in their face a bit. Now this plan was blowing up in his face. So he gets over greedy. He doesn't get less greedy. He gets more by going to the old house after seeing the jewelry that Willie and Barnabas were looking at. Is Paul Stoddard Jason McGuire? No. Is Jason McGuire Paul Stoddard? Not in my opinion. I don't think they're the same person. I do think they knew each other for a long time. Dennis Patrick's character, Jason McGuire, is Irish. I always felt that Paul Stoddard was an Irish name, and I do think that Paul Stoddard himself is Irish, and I think their history together dates back to that time in that country of Ireland, of maybe in the Irish Republican Army. I do think they did serve together, and again, that's just my theory and my opinion. I have no proof to back that, but I do think they were pals for a really, really long time. But after the Collinsport incident, he saw him, and he 10 years ago, and it was in China. I do think that Paul Stoddard's disappearance to Jason was, I think Jason ruled it as a kiss-off. That Jason ruled it as Paul really going his own way because he felt maybe Jason had betrayed him by sort of somewhat taking Liz's side in it. But Jason, I think, just more saw like, well, wait a minute, we agreed on this. Why'd you stray? I do think there's a lot between those two that is left really unanswered and unexplored. I would love to hear more about Paul Stoddard and Jason McGuire's previous life prior to Collinsport and prior to those two ever showing up there, because I do think it would be one hell of a story. Now, do I think it was wise casting Dennis Patrick as Paul Stoddard? I do. I do wish that time that they had spent, though, with his character, they would have invested. I don't feel they invested enough because he was a part of the Leviathan angle, and because there were just a lot of angles going on. I do feel they could have gotten into Paul a lot more there than they ever did. By the way, Paul Stoddard did not know Willie Loomis. That's something you could sort of tell with Jason McGuire and Willie Loomis, because Willie does not know the full plan of what happened when Jason was conning Elizabeth. He didn't know all that because he didn't know Paul. I think honestly, Jason McGuire did not meet Willie Loomis until well after the incident of Paul's alleged death. It's such an interesting aspect, an interesting character, and I love the character to death. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If there's anything I missed, let me know, or hey, if you have thoughts about the character, I'd love to hear them. Hope you guys have a great day.